Chapter 10 China's new policies split the movement, marked by Maoist fundamentalism and beset by internecine conflict. By mid-1975, the new communist movement was already in trouble. Then a controversy erupted that cut to the core of the movement's identity. In the fall of that year, the pivot of national liberation shifted from Southeast Asia to Southern Africa. The Movement for the Popular Liberation of Angola, MPLA, which had spearheaded the long struggle for Angolan independence, was confronted on the eve of victory by two self-proclaimed liberation movements backed by the U.S. and apartheid South Africa. China sided with the U.S. and South Africa, producing a political explosion that split the movement virtually down the middle. China's shift from championing national liberation to backing Washington had been in process for years. But before the end of the war in Vietnam, its full consequences were muted. Until the fall of Saigon, Vietnam remained the focal point of anti-imperialist politics, and China continued to support Vietnam even though Vietnam was also backed by it and was a close ally of the USSR. But once Southeast Asia had been liberated, it became clear that in almost every other part of the world China was willing to ally with any force, no matter how reactionary, that opposed the Soviet Union. The implementation of this policy inevitably provoked an upheaval within the new communist movement. The movement was based on the proposition that anti-revisionist Marxism-Leninism alone could provide effective guidance for the worldwide battle against imperialism. Supposedly all other trends conciliated the enemy or had actually crossed over into the enemy camp. Movement cadre insisted that internationalism lay at the very core of communist doctrine, and that betrayals of internationalism by social democracy and Soviet revisionism were the fundamental reasons revolutionaries needed to create a new political movement. Now anti-revisionists themselves were forced to choose between sticking to their roots in the struggle against U.S. imperialism or following the lead of the Chinese Communist Party. Angola was important in itself, but the crisis there triggered a full-blown split because it embodied broader issues. After all, the movement's position on U.S. military and CI activities, should they be consistently opposed, or should they be supported when directed against the USSR, necessarily affected its positions across the board. Should the military budget be cut or increased? Should opposition to some sectors of capital be suspended because of shared opposition to the USSR? Should trade union progressives be attacked for failing to embrace a foreign policy based on combating the alleged Soviet threat? To be sure, new communist groups had already displayed a damaging tendency to see splitting controversies in every disagreement over international affairs, but the events in Southern Africa crystallized a dispute that went far beyond fine points or details. The movement's basic alignment in world politics was at stake, and the prestigious revolutionary parties that had inspired the movement's formation in the first place, the Chinese and Cuban parties in particular, were on opposite sides of the barricades. Tracing how matters reached this point first requires a quick review of the evolution of China's foreign policy from the time of the Sino-Soviet split to the eve of the Southern African crisis, the Sino-Soviet split. From the victory of the Chinese Revolution in 1949 to the late 1950s, the CPC leaders saw themselves as part of a world anti-imperialist front anchored by a Soviet-led socialist camp. They reacted negatively to Khrushchev's 1956 speech criticizing Stalin and the overall drift of the CPSU's 20th Congress. But for several years there were no public indications of a dispute. Hard-nosed calculations about power, not ideology, led to the break. The decisive moment came in the months leading up to the 1959 Camp David summit between Khrushchev and U.S. President Eisenhower. During summit preparations, the Soviets unilaterally abrogated an agreement on sharing nuclear technology with China that they had signed in 1957. Apparently, the Soviet move was demanded by Washington as a precondition for détente, a trade-off for the U.S. refraining from giving nuclear weapons to West Germany. The Chinese were outraged, though not yet in public. They only revealed the existence of the 1957 agreement in 1963. They did not sympathize with Moscow's fear that a nuclear-armed German state would be tempted to reprise the 1941 Nazi surprise attack on the USSR. For them, the decision proved that the new CPSU leadership prized relations with the U.S. above the solidarity of the socialist camp. Moreover, since Washington had numerous nuclear weapons aimed at China, the CPC regarded the Soviet move as endangering China's own security. Moscow claimed that its decision shouldn't worry Beijing because China was still protected by the Soviet nuclear umbrella. But in light of Moscow's readiness to cut deals with Washington without consulting Beijing, the CPC mistrusted those assurances. The Sino-Soviet rift burst into public view after the summit. The CPC began open polemics in April 1960 and simultaneously began trying to line up support from other communist parties through face-to-face discussions. Moscow reacted furiously to the Chinese display of independence, and also to what Soviet leaders regarded as the misguided economic policies of the Great Leap Forward begun in January 1958. In July 1960, Soviet technicians and economic assistants were abruptly withdrawn from China, leaving numerous projects in the planning or construction phases. In November 1960, a meeting of 81 communist parties managed to agree on the Compromise Moscow Statement, but the differences between the CPC and CPSU were papered over rather than resolved. Matters flared up again at the October 1961 22nd Congress of the CPSU when Khrushchev attacked Albania's ruling party, China's closest ally, and Chinese Premier Zhou Enlai walked out in protest. A new round of polemics began in late 1962, and the CPC for the first time targeted the CPSU by name in its June 1963 proposal concerning the general line of the international communist movement. In July, a top-level meeting was held in Moscow in a last-ditch attempt to heal the breach. A major goal of the CPC delegation was to convince the Soviets not to sign the partial test ban treaty prohibiting above-ground nuclear tests. The Soviets refused to budge and signed the treaty with the US and Britain on August 5. To the Soviets, the agreement was a milestone in reducing the danger of nuclear escalation and war. From their point of view, the Chinese were far too cavalier in dismissing the horrors of a nuclear exchange. For example, in 1957, Mao had responded to an argument about the threat of nuclear holocaust by telling Italian communist leader Palmiro Togliatti, "Who told you that Italy must survive? 300 million Chinese will be left, then that will be enough for the human race to continue." This attitude was a major factor in the CPC's inability to garner more support within the world communist movement. Even from parties unhappy with many aspects of Soviet policy, the CPC, however, saw matters differently. To Beijing, Soviet willingness to sign a pact with the US and Britain combined with its unwillingness to help China develop its own nuclear deterrent signaled the end of socialist solidarity. 10 days after the test ban treaty was signed, Beijing made public the existence of the 1957 Sino-Soviet Nuclear Pact and its abrogation by the USSR in 1959. The July 1963 meeting between top Chinese and Soviet leaders was the last such contact between the two parties for more than 20 years. Khrushchev was ousted as head of the CPSU in 1964, but after a brief wait-and-see period, both the Chinese and the new Soviet leadership under Leonid Brezhnev concluded that no rapprochement was possible. Relations between the two countries headed further downhill. Hostility between pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese factions in communist parties around the world intensified, leading to splits, usually via the breakaway of a minority pro-China faction, where these had not already taken place. Two superpowers. From 1963 to 1966, the Chinese put forward the analysis that the Sino-Soviet split was a battle between revisionist and anti-revisionist policies within a single socialist camp and world communist movement. The CPC faction holding this view carried the day in Beijing's foreign policies, and on the key world battlefront, Vietnam, China backed the NLF and North Vietnamese. The distinguishing manifesto of this period was Lin Biao's Long of the Victory of People's War, with its assertion that the struggle of national liberation movements against the imperialists headed by the US constituted the principal contradiction in the contemporary world. But China's concrete advice to revolutionaries in particular countries was not always consistent with Lin Biao's insistence on the importance of armed struggle. For example, the CPC maintained close ties with the Indonesian Communist Party, PKI, then the world's largest non-ruling CP, and advised it to refrain from armed guerrilla war and instead maintain an alliance with the Sukarno regime, just as the CPSU encouraged pro-Soviet parties to attach themselves to supposedly progressive bourgeois regimes in other countries. The PKI took this course and the result was catastrophe. In October 1965, the Indonesian military turned on the left, slaughtered up to 1.5 million people, and all but completely destroyed the PKI, thus securing the most populous country in Southeast Asia for the US at a key juncture in Washington's intervention in Vietnam. Where the CPC did stick to Lin's People's War theory, however, was in assigning little importance to the role of the socialist camp or to workers' movements in the advanced capitalist countries. The full implications of that posture became clear in early 1966. In the wake of U.S. escalation in Vietnam, leaders of the Japanese Communist Party traveled to China, Vietnam, and Korea carrying a proposal for joint action in Vietnam's defense. They called for China and the USSR to put a moratorium on their dispute for the sake of aiding Vietnam, and won support from both the Vietnamese and Koreans. While some CPC leaders welcomed the proposal, Mao was bitterly opposed and blocked it. The CPC began to advocate no united action with revisionism, an idea not found in the earlier 1963 to 1964 polemics as a revolutionary principle. China also ended its trade aid package to Cuba, which Beijing considered too closely allied with the USSR. Then in May 1966 came the Cultural Revolution. The upheaval was framed as a crusade to prevent China from taking the capitalist road, and for several years China turned inward and foreign policy was not a major concern. But those CPC leaders who had been most supportive of the Japanese CP's proposal for joint action, a group that overlapped with the main authors of the 1963 to 1964 anti-revisionist polemics, were among the first criticized to be as capitalist roaders and removed from their posts. At the height of the Cultural Revolution in the fall of 1967, a series of articles in the Chinese press for the first time asserted publicly that capitalism had been restored in the Soviet Union. These watershed pieces were put together and published in 1968 in the collection How the Soviet Revisionists Carry Out All-Round Restoration of Capitalism in the USSR. Then came the 1968 Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia. The CPC justified its intervention with the Brezhnev Doctrine, which claimed that the sovereignty of any one socialist country could be violated in order to ensure the security of the socialist camp as a whole. Implicitly, it was the Soviet Party that would decide when such violations were necessary. The Chinese, not surprisingly, interpreted both the invasion and the self-serving Soviet rationalization as a threat to their own security. 2 months after the invasion, Mao called the USSR social imperialist for the first time, and the CPC declared that the USSR and the US were two superpowers that were equally dangerous to the people of the world. Behind the scenes a dispute raged, however. Lin Biao seemingly still considered the US the main danger, while Mao argued that the main threat came from the USSR. In the spring and summer of 1969 there were armed clashes along the Soviet-Chinese border and hints that the Soviet Union was seeking Washington's tacit support for a strike against China's nuclear capacity, perhaps using nuclear weapons. These border battles did not turn into all-out war, but Sino-Soviet tensions remained at boiling point levels. In 1970, Mao stated that the Soviet Union today is under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, a dictatorship of the big bourgeoisie, a dictatorship of the German fascist type, a dictatorship of the Hitler type. Long gone was the 1963 to 1964 framework about a clash of revisionist versus anti-revisionist policies within a single socialist camp. For their part, the Soviets continued to argue that China was a socialist country, but attacked the CPC leadership as petty bourgeois nationalists and ultra-leftists who were splitting the communist movement and objectively supporting imperialism toward alignment with Washington. By 1971, the dominant faction in the CPC decided that an opening to Washington would strengthen China's security as well as create new opportunities for economic development. The Nixon administration, for a different set of reasons, simultaneously decided to make an overture to Beijing. Nixon and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger had developed a new strategy to deal with the challenge to U.S. hegemony stemming from national liberation movements and Soviet attainment of strategic nuclear parity. It consisted of offering the USSR détente in exchange for Soviet good behavior in the Third World, while simultaneously trying to woo China to Washington's side. A delicate courtship between Washington and Beijing ensued. The first step was an April 1971 trip by the U.S. table tennis team to China, ping-pong diplomacy. 2 months later, Nixon declared an end to Washington's 22-year embargo on trade with the People's Republic. On July 9, 1971, Kissinger flew in secret to Beijing for talks with Zhou Enlai. 6 days later, Nixon announced that he would visit China. The next month, an editorial in the CPC's People's Daily for the first time indicated that the Soviet Union was a greater danger than the U.S. All this intensified the factional battle already underway in the CPC. During the preparations for Nixon's visit, Lin Biao, opposed to rapprochement with Washington, either attempted a power grab or faced arrest before being able to make such a bid. He tried to flee China, probably to the USSR, and was killed in a suspicious plane crash on September 12. Nixon arrived the following February. The Shanghai communique issued on the conclusion of his visit marked a major breakthrough for China. Nixon stated that Taiwan is part of China, while Beijing made no promise to pressure the Vietnamese to make concessions to Washington, which the Western press had speculated was one of Nixon's major goals. but behind the scenes Nixon and Kissinger had met their objectives, with both sides agreeing to begin construction of an anti-Soviet bloc. Indeed, China's shift away from solidarity with other Third World left-wing movements had begun even before Nixon arrived. Particularly striking was Beijing's response to the unsuccessful April 1971 rebellion against the conservative government of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka. The uprising was brutally crushed, and the governments of the US, Britain, India, and the USSR all sent support to the regime. On the surface, this seemed to be confirmation of China's earlier thesis that the West and the Soviet bloc were colluding to put a lid on revolutions. But this time China also sent a message of congratulations to the Chinese government and denounced foreign spies among the insurgents. Beijing's message led to rumblings even among many of China's supporters, who were especially upset by the C-pieces playing into the long-standing anti-communist argument that popular rebellions were inevitably the work of outside agitators. Even more disturbing was China's reaction to the CIA-backed coup in Chile. While progressive governments throughout the world condemned the coup and tried to isolate the new Pinochet regime, China was among the first countries to recognize the new government, and at the UN was the only country besides the US to abstain from voting for a resolution to aid Chilean refugees. Beijing established warm relations with Pinochet and his generals and hosted an official Chilean delegation on the second anniversary of the coup. Also in 1973, China cut off aid to the liberation movement in Oman, which had been fighting that country's feudal regime and its main backer, the Shah of Iran. Simultaneously, Beijing began to refer to the Shah's CIA-backed government as a bulwark against the USSR and expressed enthusiasm for the Shah's purchases of massive quantities of US arms. Elsewhere in the Middle East, China hailed Egypt's 1972 expulsion of Soviet military advisors and its turn toward alliance with the US, remained silent about attacks on the Palestinian movement, and praised attempts by reactionary Arab governments to impose restrictions on the Palestinians. Then in 1974, China sided with the pro-Western Portuguese Socialist Party SPI against the left following the April overthrow of the fascist regime. The SPI was forthright about its goal of keeping Portugal in NATO and preventing social transformation within the country. To its left stood a broad alliance of trade unions, radicalized sections of the armed forces movement, the Portuguese Communist Party, and several smaller Marxist organizations. At first, the left held substantial initiative, but lost ground when SPI leader Mario Soros declared martial law in November 1975. China backed the Soros crackdown on the grounds that the Portuguese CP was an agent of Soviet social imperialism and constituted the main danger to the country. Beijing also began to argue for strengthening NATO, which was no longer characterized as a military alliance serving U.S. imperialism but as a bulwark of European defense against the USSR. The theory of the three worlds. The theoretical strategic rationale for China's changed foreign policy was put forward on April 10, 1974, when Deng Xiaoping presented China's theory of the three worlds to the UN in a major address. In common usage up to that point, First World had referred to the advanced capitalist countries, Second World to the Soviet-led Eastern European bloc, and Third World to the oppressed and underdeveloped countries of Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America. The Three Worlds theory attempted to redefine these categories. It characterized the US and the USSR as two superpowers who together constituted the First World. The Third World remained the oppressed nations mostly in the global South, and the Second World now referred to the developed countries of both Eastern and Western Europe, and Japan, supposedly in between the First and Third Worlds. The Chinese theory redefined the contours of the world revolutionary struggle. The anti-revisionist polemics of the early 60s had emphasized the long-standing communist position that the socialist countries, national liberation movements, and workers' movements in the advanced capitalist metropolis, these were the three essential components of a single world revolutionary process. They identified the common enemy as imperialism, criticized neocolonialism as a cover for exploitation, and proclaimed the goal of worldwide socialist transformation. All of these concepts disappeared in the Three Worlds theory. Instead, the main struggle in the world was considered to be that of the Third World, sometimes able to enlist the Second World as an ally, against domination by the First World. Struggles between class forces within any of the worlds were given virtually no importance. In the initial 1974 version of the Three Worlds theory, the two superpowers were accused of both imperialism and hegemonism, a term connoting domination but not linked like imperialism to any particular class structure. Imperialism generally remained Beijing's epithet of choice when it was criticizing the US, while hegemonism was shorthand for the USSR. Soon Beijing's long-standing call for a united front against imperialism was replaced by calls for a united front against hegemonism. By this time, just about everyone outside pro-China circles, from other Marxists to right-wingers, recognized both China's foreign policy shift and its value to the U.S. Veteran anti-imperialist Tariq Ali captured the dominant sentiment in the non-Maoist left, once the injured party in the Sino-Soviet dispute and the advocate of more militant opposition to American imperialism. After the so-called Cultural Revolution, China became the aggressor in a propaganda war against the USSR of unprecedented virulence and the suitor of favors from Washington. From 1972 onwards, Chinese external policy changed color throughout the world. The same shift was identified by a group of pro-capitalist scholars close to Washington policymakers. They categorized China's foreign policy in the 1950s as that of an aligned with the USSR radical state and saw China in the early 1960s as an independent radical state. But from the early to the late 1970s, they characterized China as a semi-aligned with the U.S. reformist state, and from the late 1970s to 1982 as an aligned with the U.S. conservative state. Differences in denial. Only within the new communist movement was China's alignment with Western imperialism downplayed or denied. Anti-revisionists by and large accepted the thesis that the Soviet Union posed some level of threat to China and conducted itself in a hegemon's manner in other parts of the world. This justified, in their eyes, a certain degree of tactical maneuvering on China's part. And through 1975, China's continuing support for Vietnam was weighed more heavily than Beijing's policies elsewhere. But there were mounting doubts and strains. On the level of general analysis, the Revolutionary Union, October League, Iworkian and others accepted the Chinese position that the Soviet Union had fully restored capitalism and was social imperialist. Countries and movements closely allied to the USSR, Cuba especially, were considered Soviet puppets in the same way that neo-colonial governments or Contra armies propped up by Washington were regarded as U.S. puppets. The view dominant in 1969 to 1971, that the USSR was colluding and contending with the US to suppress revolutions and divide the globe between them, was replaced in 1972 to 1973 with denunciations of the USSR as a rising imperialist power threatening to dominate the world. When the theory of the three worlds was proclaimed in 1974, all the groups most heavily influenced by Maoism rushed to embrace it, though the RU retained reservations, and after Mao's death attacked it and denied that Mao had been its author. In contrast, groups and individuals loyal to the original thrust of Third World Marxism held fast to the position, reinforced by confrontations on every continent, that U.S. imperialism was the prime enemy of national liberation movements. While remaining critical of Soviet foreign policy, few believed that the USSR functioned on the basis of the same structural imperatives as U.S. monopoly capitalism, and rather than being unfriendly to Third World parties that were allied with the Soviets, they generally supported them and were especially enthusiastic about Cuba's assistance to both Latin American and African liberation movements. The Guardian was the main voice of these views, which were shared by several smaller collectives. The CLCLP also disputed the view that the USSR was capitalist, based on the orthodox Stalinist position that it was a society's economic base that determined its fundamental character, even if the ruling party, part of the superstructure, was revisionist. Before 1975, these different Maoist tendencies frequently found common ground. They all defended China against widespread criticism that Nixon's 1972 trip represented a betrayal. They stressed the fact that China had broken out of diplomatic isolation, forced U.S. recognition of its claim to Taiwan, and given away nothing in terms of support for Vietnam. The Guardian, for instance, praised the trip in a lead editorial, though it saw fit to simultaneously flag solidarity with Cuba by running a second editorial entitled "Cuba Shows How." Differences within the movement deepened as the shift in China's policy became more pronounced in the year after Nixon's visit. China's warm relations with the Pinochet regime were the subject of sharp debate in The Guardian's pages and elsewhere. While The Guardian backed the Iranian Student Association's efforts to build a movement around the slogan "No Arms to the Shah" and continued to support the Popular Front for the Liberation of Oman, the October League favored U.S. arms sales to Tehran and followed Beijing's lead in dropping support for the Omani left, focus on Puerto Rico. In 1974, controversy raged about the appropriate stance toward the Puerto Rican independence struggle. The Puerto Rican Socialist Party spearheaded organizing for an October 27 Day of Solidarity with Puerto Rico, whose high point was a 20,000-plus rally in Madison Square Garden. Speakers at the event ranged from Geraldo Rivera, then a television reporter, to ALSC leader Osuisudoke, Angela Davis of the CPUSA, Guardian executive editor Erwin Silber, and Jerry Tung of the Asian study group WVO. When Tung raised the Maoist slogan "Superpowers out of Puerto Rico," he was shouted down by the crowd with shouts of "Unidad, Unidad," that did not stop WVO and others who followed China's line from going further in the same vein. The CPC loyalists attacked Cuba, which most of the Puerto Rican left regarded as its most stalwart international champion, and accused the PSB of being a fifth column for Soviet-Cuban penetration of the island. It was widely noted on the left that these charges were identical with Washington's, when in September 1975 the largest ever international conference in support of Puerto Rican independence was held in Havana, China, and its followers denounced and boycotted the event. In contrast, The Guardian hailed the leadership of the PSB, lauded Cuba's role, and sent executive editor Silber to the meeting. Afterwards, leading figures from the paper's staff, including Silber, assumed prominent positions within the PSB-initiated Puerto Rican Solidarity Committee, PRSA, which played a key role among anti-imperialist activists for several years after its formation in 1975. A nearly identical division arose regarding events in Portugal. After the fascist regime was overthrown, the OL echoed Beijing's line that the USSR, operating through the Portuguese CP, was the main threat to the Portuguese people. RU did not call the USSR the main problem, but agreed that both superpowers were making trouble in Portugal. The Guardian, especially via coverage by Wilfred Burchett and other collectives as well as Monthly Review, put forward a completely different view, targeting the danger from pro-capitalist and neo-fascist forces and expressing solidarity with the left alignment, which included the Portuguese Communist Party. By 1975, the OL, having achieved premier status in the Maoist camp, was arguing that the main blow must be directed at the USSR and calling for steps to strengthen NATO. Both OL and RU published lengthy volumes trying to back up the Chinese claim that the USSR was capitalist, the Chinese themselves having presented little in the way of theoretical or historical evidence. RU issued red papers No. 7. How Capitalism Has Been Restored in the Soviet Union, and What It Means for the World Struggle in 1974, and OL followed in 1975 with Martin Nicolau's Restoration of Capitalism in the USSR. The hostility between RU and OL was so great by this time that the two immediately exchanged polemics, charging that the other's version of the capitalist restoration thesis was itself revisionist, unintentionally casting doubt on the whole proposition. With positions within diverging to such a degree, a showdown was inevitable. For West European sympathizers with China, events in Portugal catalyzed a decisive split. In the U.S., where intervention in the Third World was of far more concern to 1960s veterans than struggles in Europe, the trigger turned out to be Angola. Spotlight on Angola. The Movement for the Popular Liberation of Angola, MPLA, was founded as a clandestine movement against Portuguese colonialism in December 1956. Emma Clark Cabral, then living in Angola, was among its founding members. Led by Marxists and allied with Frelimo in Mozambique and the Cabral-led PIGC in Guinea-Bissau, the MPLA spearheaded the independence struggle in the largest and potentially richest country in Portugal's African empire. It launched armed actions in 1961 and, along with Frelimo and the PIGC, waged the lengthy struggle that produced the crisis and overthrow of Portuguese fascism in 1974. Through the 1960s and 1970s, however, the MPLA was not the only movement operating within Angola. In 1961, Washington's incoming Kennedy administration, recognizing that eventually the full decolonization of Africa was inevitable, went looking for local players to sponsor as future rulers of neocolonial regimes. In Angola, Washington chose the virulently anti-Marxist Holden Roberto in his Front for the Liberation of Angola, FLA. That very year, Ghanaian leader Kwame Nkrumah denied Roberto assistance on the grounds that he was already in the pay of America, a judgment confirmed by numerous sources including the New York Times, which described Roberto as chosen by President John F. Kennedy and the CIA to forge a link between the U.S. and the indigenous groups that were expected someday to drive Portugal from Angola. In the mid-1960s, the FNLA was joined by the Union for the Total Independence of Angola, UNITA, founded by Jonas Savimbi. Savimbi, who had served for several years under Roberto, was similarly anti-left as well as personally ambitious and dictatorial. He left the FNLA feeling that the group was discredited and that he could do better in a new organization that had hidden rather than open links with Washington and South Africa. the FNL and UNITA conducted only minor activities against the Portuguese, so when the Portuguese regime was overthrown, the MPLA was far and away in the best position to lead the first post-independence government. Washington, already humiliated in Vietnam, saw the MPLA as a grave threat. So did South Africa, which was especially alarmed by the prospect of a revolutionary Angola aiding the fight being waged in neighboring Namibia against Pretoria's illegal occupation. Both scrambled to head off an MPLA victory by sending increased quantities of aid to the FNL and UNITA, which quickly shifted to fighting the MPLA rather than the Portuguese. Hoping to avert a bloody conflict, the MPLA signed an agreement with the FNL and UNITA in January 1975 calling for a transitional three-party coalition government until independence could be declared and elections held. The FNL and UNITA immediately broke the agreement. In March, Zaire's CIA-backed dictator Mobutu Sese Seko sent his army into Angola to establish a power base for the FNL, and in August, South African troops crossed into Angola from occupied Namibia in an anti-MPLA invasion coordinated with UNITA, Zaire, the FNL and the CIA. The date for formal independence had been set for November 11, and by October 23 South African troops had driven north from Namibia 1,000 miles into the country. On November 7 and 10, Zairean troops backed by Portuguese mercenaries and South African armored cars pushed within 15 miles of Luanda before being driven back by MPLA soldiers defending the capital. On November 11, the MPLA declared independence and immediately requested international assistance. Cuban troops started arriving in Angola on Soviet transports within days, and the combined MPLA-Cuban armies drove back the Contra Alliance. The MPLA-Cuban advance was applauded by anti-colonial and anti-imperialist forces worldwide, and nowhere more strongly than in South Africa itself. Black South Africans gathered around radios and television sets daily and cheered every defeat inflicted upon the South African military. Indeed, the MPLA-Cuban success was a key factor in fueling the watershed Soweto uprising in June 1976 and the 18 months of mass upheaval within South Africa that followed. Meanwhile, top U.S. policymakers led by Henry Kissinger pushed for direct intervention to rescue their faltering clients, but U.S. memories of the Vietnam quagmire were too fresh, and opposition from the African American community and peace movement too strong for Kissinger to prevail. In what was widely termed the first tangible example of the Vietnam syndrome, Congress instead passed the Clark Amendment prohibiting any aid to forces trying to overthrow the Angolan government. Heavy fighting continued well into 1976, though by the end of that year Washington and Pretoria's goals had been reduced to bleeding the Angolan government instead of overthrowing it. In this they succeeded all too well, though the FNL quickly disappeared. Savimbi's UNITA managed to stay afloat and carry on a bloody insurgency that has cost tens of thousands of lives and continues to this day. The alignment of forces in Angola paralleled that in most other national liberation struggles of the 1960s and 1970s. What made Angola unique was what Monthly Review called the involvement of the People's Republic of China on the side of imperialism. Instead of aligning itself with the Angolan left, the progressive countries in the rest of Africa and the Third World, and the international anti-imperialist movement, Beijing formed a tacit alliance with Washington and Pretoria and directed its fire at the MPLA, Cuba and the USSR. Splits in the new communist movement. Within the U.S. left, support for the MPLA, or at least opposition to Washington as the main threat to Angolan independence, was all but universal. Monthly Review came down solidly behind the MPLA and was explicitly critical of Beijing. The Black Scholar did likewise. Groups and tendencies ranging from the CPUSA to the PSP to Prairie Fire all backed the MPLA. Unaffiliated radicals and veterans of the anti-Vietnam War movement focused their energies on stopping U.S. aid to the FNL and UNITA and thwarting any attempt at military intervention. Internal conflict raged only within the new communist movement, where China's stance transformed long-simmering antagonisms into an all-out confrontation. In practical organizing, movement activists participated in rival coalitions and demonstrations. China's backers, led by the OL and including most of the largest groups, rallied under the banner Superpowers out of Angola, while those who differed with Beijing joined the rest of the U.S. left in demanding no U.S. intervention. On the level of polemic, the CPC's defenders directed their main criticism at the USSR, accused the Cuban forces in Angola of committing atrocities and charged their opponents with covering up for revisionism. The Guardian, CLP and several smaller groups praised the Cubans for selfless internationalism, defended the MPLA's right to accept aid from the USSR just as the Vietnamese had, and denounced the Maoist camp for collaborating with U.S. imperialism. The practical and polemical battle within the movement lasted from the fall of 1975 to late 1976. Shouting matches at demonstrations and forums were common, and several events stopped just short of chair-throwing brawls. The Guardian sent Silber a nationwide speaking tour titled The International Line of the U.S. Left, which drew its largest crowd, 1,000, in New York City June 4, 1976. The RCP weighed in with the March 1976 publication of a pamphlet entitled Cuba, The Evaporation of a Myth, From Anti-Imperialist Revolution to Pawn of Social Imperialism, and then sponsored a November 1976 conference on the international situation, revolution, and the internationalist tasks of the American people. At the gathering, which drew 2,300, the RCP attempted to distance itself from others in the two superpowers camp by charging that the OL, backed now by Fanchen author William Hinton, was misinterpreting China's line by directing its main fire at the USSR. The RCP claimed that it alone had mastered the art of opposing both superpowers equally. The entire left was witness to Maoism's unraveling, especially after The Guardian decided to run an extended debate on China's foreign policy beginning May 5, 1976. The series began with two articles. One, by Wilfred Burchett, presented a factual account of the Angolan conflict and exposed a number of false claims about the MPLA made by the Chinese. The second, by Hinton, said little about Angola but argued on the basis of meetings with top CPC leaders that China had indeed shifted to seeing the Soviet Union as the more dangerous of the two superpowers. Hinton forthrightly stated that all of Beijing's policies, which he defended, flowed from that premise. The debate proceeded for 4 months and offered a host of different opinions. It included several pieces refuting the Chinese claim that the USSR was fast becoming a stronger military and economic power than the US. Respected left analysts who were not Marxist-Leninists, in particular Michael Clare, author of the landmark War Without End, American Planning for the Next V-Tense, buttressed that case. The Guardian wrapped it up with an editorial restating paper's friendship with China but disagreeing with Beijing's stance on Angola right down the line. It concluded that there can be no communist party, especially in the heartland of U.S. imperialism, that does not base itself on proletarian internationalism. In the case of Angola, many of the party-building forces were found wanting, and none of the tortured explanations and rationalizations for their position can explain that away. Fury was mounting on all sides. China Books charged The Guardian with being anti-China and stopped selling the paper. Guardian supporters picketed China Books shops in New York and San Francisco in response. By the end of 1976, the movement was irreparably split into two antagonistic camps. The rupture was acknowledged on both sides. From the Maoist camp, former Guardian staffer, now OL leader Carl Davidson, said that the recent war in Angola has drawn sharp lines of demarcation in the struggle between Marxism-Leninism and revisionism. On the other side, The Guardian held that a bitter fight over class collaborationism had come to a head over Angola and led to a decisive split. And besides such statements, just about all contact or cooperation in practical work was broken off, and the groups on either side of the Angola divide worked almost exclusively with others who shared their international analysis. From the Maoist point of view, this rupture reflected the capitulation of the weak-kneed section of the new communist movement to Soviet revisionism. But in a broader frame, its essence was Maoism's breakaway from the world anti-imperialist front and from the Third World Marxist current that stood in its front rank, losing initiative on the left. While the anti-revisionists were shattering into ever more hostile factions, other sections of the socialist left were on the move. As early as the 1974 busing crisis, the movement's inability to intervene on the basis of a unified strategy left room for other tendencies to regain initiative. The CPUSA and SWP, both of which supported busing, stepped into the breach in Boston, as wages and living standards came under heightened pressure during the steep 1974 to 1975 recession. Rival leftists outstripped the new communist movement in efforts to organize a broad-based coalition to fight back. The most ambitious attempt along these lines began in 1975 and culminated in the Hard Times Conference held January 30 to February 1, 1976, in Chicago. Activists in and around the Prairie Fire Organizing Committee played the point role in organizing the conference, though to do so they largely abandoned their long-standing stress on anti-imperialism in favor of economic justice and even populist themes. Following the event, PFOC was thrown into a period of internal self-criticism and struggle as a result. Preparatory work for the conference mobilized a large number of activists from a broad range of organizations. Over 2,000 people turned out, but the conference suffered from extreme lack of focus, at some points bordering on utter disarray, and did not meet its goal of setting up an ongoing coalition. The proceedings only avoided complete embarrassment because of the strong role played by large delegations from CASA and the PSP. The Puerto Rican Socialist Party, then at the height of its influence, anchored the other broad-based mobilization of 1976, a Philadelphia demonstration designed to counter official celebrations of the U.S. bicentennial. The rally's main demand was for a bicentennial without colonies. A diverse coalition, including many groups that had worked on the Hard Times Conference and organizations that were distancing themselves from Maoism, such as the Guardian and KDP, participated in the mobilization. 40,000 turned out on July 4, and 10,000 more in San Francisco. This was a respectable showing, but nowhere near the size of the huge protest marches of 1969 to 1972, a fall-off that reflected the battering that key constituencies for left politics had been experiencing since 1973 to 1974. And absent the kind of radical ferment that had existed among young voters, communities of color, and students just a few years before, it was easy for the media to bury reports of the protest amid a barrage of flag-waving bicentennial coverage. RU sponsored a rival protest in Philadelphia on the same day, attended by about 3,000. With revolutionary groups outside the new communist movement leading the Hard Times and July 4 efforts, and the movement embroiled in a nasty internal fight, the movement's appeal to unaffiliated radicals was declining fast. Individuals continued to embrace Marxism-Leninism or join a particular anti-revisionist group, but the late 1960s, early 1970s phenomenon of entire layers of activists flocking to this trend was no longer in evidence. Indeed, the left's political map was changing rapidly. As already noted, by 1976, revolutionary nationalism had also lost much of the initiative it had held a few years earlier. Overall, non-revolutionary variants of socialism and radicalism were gaining ground at the expense of the entire revolutionary left. The clearest sign of this shift was the appearance of In These Times (ITD) newspaper in November 1976. ITD was the latest in a series of vehicles launched by James Weinstein to regain the initiative for left social democracy. As a weekly newspaper, ITD was a much more ambitious enterprise than Socialist Revolution magazine, launched with a similar purpose, had been 6 years before. It was also markedly to the right of the original Senior. ITD's immediate objective was to supplant The Guardian as the country's preeminent left newspaper. Well financed by Weinstein and a handful of other individuals who happened to enjoy personal wealth, In These Times began with a major promotional campaign, quickly attained a readership in the 10,000-plus range, and within a year was showing promise of at least matching its long-established rival. The reinvigoration of left social democracy in the U.S. was buttressed by the flurry of excitement surrounding the turn to Euro-communism by the Italian, Spanish, and other European communist parties. For many activists, Euro-communism in the mid-1970s played something like the role that Maoism had played a decade earlier. It seemed to offer a more democratic and innovative version of socialism than that of the Soviet Union. Even further to the right, non-socialist currents began to capture some of the energy that had previously flowed toward revolutionary organizations. Another publication founded in 1976 was Mother Jones magazine, which was oriented largely toward participants in the 1960s movements who had now joined the professional and middle classes and taken up Democratic Party politics. That same year saw the beginning of the large-scale, anti-nuclear, nonviolent direct action movement with the formation of the Clamshell Alliance. This movement captured the imagination of many young white people and, while undoubtedly radical, was much more influenced by anarchism and feminism than socialism or Marxism. More generally, the so-called new social movements on the rise, the women's, lesbian, gay, and anti-nuclear movements, were far less hospitable to Leninist ideas than the student, anti-war, and anti-racist movements of the 1960s. And in electoral politics, openings for progressive activists seemed to be expanding both on the local level and nationally within the orbit of Jimmy Carter's 1976 outsider presidential campaign. Mao dies and Reagan ascends. Even more important in pushing anti-revisionism downhill were broader changes in the political landscape. If 1976 began with turmoil over China's policy in Angola, it ended in apprehension about where China was headed in the absence of the man whose name had become virtually synonymous with the Chinese Revolution. Mao Zedong died in Beijing on September 9, 1976 at the age of 82. Hugo chosen to succeed Mao as CPC chairman, pledged to continue Mao's policies. But questions were immediately raised about the unity of the CPC's top leadership when less than a month later Mao's closest allies, including his widow Zhang Qing, were arrested, charged with being a counter-revolutionary gang of four and targeted for public vilification. The purge came on top of an already tumultuous year at the top of the CPC. Premier Zhou Enlai died in January, and Deng Xiaoping, restored to a high post in 1973 after having been a central target of the Cultural Revolution, was purged again in April on charges of once again trying to lead China down the capitalist road. Many observers were convinced that beneath his pro-Mao rhetoric Huo Gofeng supported Deng, and that the arrest of the Gang of Four was a first step toward bringing Deng back to the central leadership. As of the end of 1976, this had not yet occurred. But just 7 months later, the man once termed the number 2 person in authority taking the capitalist road was appointed vice premier and was clearly on his way to even greater power. Further disruption in the Maoist ranks was evident at the November 1976 Congress of the Albanian Party of Labour, PLA, when leader Enver Hoxha, long China's closest ally, made a number of remarks widely interpreted as criticisms of China's alignment with the U.S. Ambiguities concerning the position of the Albanian party persisted for a few months, but in July 1977 the Albanians issued a broadside pillaring the CPC's theory of the three worlds. Closer to home, forces were gathering that would soon move the entire structure of U.S. politics sharply to the right. Electoral backlashes against the anti-war and anti-racist movements had been a force since the mid-1960s, as evidenced by George Wallace's presidential campaigns. But beginning in the mid-1970s, changed circumstances produced a reactionary surge of heightened intensity. From the point of view of business leaders, two urgent matters topped the agenda: one, stopping and reversing the threat posed by the spread of national liberation and the Soviet attainment of rough nuclear parity; two, finding a way to restructure the economy to regain high profit margins despite the end of the long post-war boom. Focusing on these concerns, significant sections of capital were exploring options for a much more aggressive posture even as they were making the concessions required to extricate themselves from Southeast Asia. Related to this motion on the part of big capital but operating on a distinct grassroots level, conservative activists were beginning to construct the infrastructure for a new right. The term was first used in 1975, that would add attacks on feminism and homosexuality to their time-tested backlash arsenal of racism and anti-communism. Ronald Reagan's challenge to incumbent Gerald Ford for the 1976 Republican presidential nomination was the most visible sign that a new reactionary force was bidding for power. Following the 1976 balloting, former staffers in Reagan's campaign formed the National Conservative Political Action Committee to press the new right's cause. The mid-1970s also saw the rise of Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority, Anita Bryant's Anti-Gay Crusades, Phyllis Schlafly's Anti-Air Eagle Forum, and a host of organizations pushing the anti-abortion crusade. The infamous Hyde Amendment forbidding use of Medicaid funds for abortions first passed Congress in 1976 and has continued to pass every year since. Additionally, encompassing big capital and the new right but extending far beyond them, a wide swath of the purported layers of U.S. society were mobilizing behind what amounted to a broadly embracing have politics. Expressions of this rising coalition included the rolling earthquake of suburban protests after 1976, including the anti-busing movements, campaigns for a return to educational basics, landlord and realtor mobilizations, truly massive, with hundreds of thousands of ardent members organized against rent control and public housing, and most importantly, what the Los Angeles Herald Tribune once called the Watts Riot of the Middle Classes, California's property tax cutting Proposition 13 and its spin-off T-Ax revolts, which forced 19 states to enact legislative or constitutional limits on property or income taxes, still holding a tremendous grip on U.S. politics today. The alignment of have sectors formed under such banners was a defining factor in shaping the dynamics of the late 1970s and then bringing Reagan to power. Meanwhile, the administration put together by Jimmy Carter looked like anything but a liberal resurgence. The president's top foreign policy advisor was extreme hawk and anti-Soviet crusaders Zbigniew Brzezinski, and the stamp of the Rockefeller-sponsored Trilateral Commission was all over Carter's foreign, defense, and economic policies. Big business was reaping the fruit of initiatives taken earlier in the decade. For example, the formation in 1972 of the Business Roundtable, which included over 160 of the largest U.S. corporations and set as its main goal promoting a pro-business agenda in both major parties. Further, the election of New South Carter notwithstanding, the backlash against the anti-racist gains of the 1960s continued to gather steam. The next major development after the campaign against the Boston busing plan was the frontal assault on affirmative action conducted under the banner of reverse discrimination. The point role was assumed by a lawsuit against the University of California by Alan Back, a disappointed white applicant to medical school who claimed he had been discriminated against because a certain number of spots had been allocated for minorities. On September 16, 1976, the California Supreme Court found for Back. The UC Regents, Back's nominal opponents, had argued a weak case, refusing to offer evidence of the long-standing and pervasive discrimination that its affirmative action program was designed to address. Appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, the Back case would over the next year move to the center of the anti-racist agenda, taking stock. But the new communist movement was now less prepared to cope with mounting danger than it had been at any time since its birth. 8 years after its inception, and just 3 years after a united anti-revisionist party seemed as if it might be taking shape, the movement was in disarray. In each of the 3 areas where it had claimed to distinguish itself, fighting racism, building an effective organization, and promoting internationalism, large sections of the movement had strayed widely off track and the prestige of the movement as a whole had plummeted. Movement groups had left a trail of lost opportunities and embittered activists through the sectarian maneuvers that had wreaked havoc in once vital organizations such as Vietnam Veterans Against the War and the ALSC, and were now in the process of doing the same in the Southern Conference Educational Fund. The rift over international line had emerged as the overriding internal division in the movement, splitting it into 2 hostile wings. The pro-China wing contained the largest and most developed organizations, but it was tied to a perspective driving it toward alignment with Washington and isolating it from the rest of the left. The wing that upheld the heritage of 1960s anti-imperialism and Third World Marxism was more in tune with the thinking of the bulk of progressives, but it was smaller and far less well-organized. Moreover, there were deep problems and disagreements on both sides. Among the forces that followed China, WVO, IWK and others hurled epithets at each other and treated RURCP, still the largest single group, as a pariah. On the other side, many of the groups and circles that had broken with China's foreign policy were just beginning to get acquainted with each other, and the largest organization in this group, the CLP, was off in its own corner promoting a return to orthodox Stalinism. All components of the movement were thus entering a period fraught with difficulties, but then so was everyone else across the political spectrum. Given the turmoil that gripped the country and the world between 1968 and 1976, every tendency from left to right had made errors and had suffered setbacks in one area or another. The question was, which of them could learn something from their mistakes, develop an accurate assessment of new realities, coordinate their members' work on the basis of an effective strategy, and gain influence in the next round of struggles. The Maoists believed that they remained best positioned to accomplish these tasks, based on organizational strength and allegiance to the ruling party in the world's most populous country. Within the new communist movement's other wing there was determination to make a fresh start, and a measure of excitement about being freed from the kind of relationship with the CPC that had reinforced not just a backward international line but a general tendency toward dogmatic thinking, voluntarism and sectarianism. Perhaps liberated from that ideological straitjacket, this new current, even if initially weak in numbers and organization, could reinvigorate Marxist-Leninist theory and build a flexible revolutionary party rooted in the complex realities of the U.S. in the late 20th century. At least that was the hope.